Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you this morning. My name is Russell Hancock. I'm the President and CEO of Joint Venture Silicon Valley Network. And so it's in that capacity that I'm welcoming you to our offices this morning. We're delighted that you're here. Our event this morning is co-sponsored by the New America Foundation. So I'd like to recognize Mark Paul, who's here as their official representative and also a member of our panel, in fact, serving as our moderator this morning. We're really happy that our two organizations can team up on events such as these, a topic of considerable importance for the state of California, and of course an election coming right up. So I won't go into any of the substance. We have some very distinguished people to talk about the substance of the issue this morning. We're anxious to get to that, but I want to first introduce a member of the Joint Venture Board of Directors. He is Tim Haight, president of Menlo College, and I've asked him if he would make a few welcoming remarks and then introduce our distinguished panelists. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Russ, and on behalf of Silicon Valley Joint Ventures, I'd like to welcome you here this morning as well. Late next month, we're going to have an important election, and one for the first time that since I've been in California, we won't have anyone to vote out of office, so it'll be an interesting time. And so we do have a distinguished panel of experts here, and their credentials are so impressive that I'm going to have to read them rather than cite them by memory. First, in the middle, we have Lauren Kay, is the president of the California Foundation of Commerce and Education, a think tank affiliated with the California Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Kay has developed a career to developing, analyzing, and implementing public policy issues in California, with a special emphasis on improving the state's business and economic climate. He serves as a senior policy positions for Governor Pete Wilson, including Cabinet Secretary to the Governor and Undersecretary of California's Trade and Commerce Agency. Next, we have Gene Ross, who joined the California Budget Project as the first executive director in 1995. The CBP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established to promote a better understanding of state fiscal and economic policy issues and their impact on low and middle income Californians. Ms. Ross is a frequent speaker on fiscal and economic policy issues and has published numerous reports and articles. Next, we have John Fleshman, who is the founder and publisher of the Flash Report organization, the web voice of California conservatives, formerly Deputy Director of Public Affairs for the Orange County Sheriff's Department. John is the president of the Fleshman Consulting Group, a public affairs and political consulting firm, and vice chairman, South, of the California Republican Party. Next, we have Joe Matthews, Irvine Senior Fellow at the New American and the Fourth Generation Californian, writes about his home state and its politics, media, labor, and real estate. He is the author of The People's Machine, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the Rise of the Blockbuster Democracy, an account of Governor Schwarzenegger's first term and his use of ballot measures as governing tools. Before joining New America, he was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, I was thinking ahead, and also my hometown, the Baltimore Sun. His blog, Blockbuster Democracy, tracks direct democracy initiatives, referendums, and recalls in California and around the world. Finally, we have our moderator, Mr. Mark Paul. Mr. Paul is a senior scholar and deputy director of the California Program for New American Foundation, who has been writing and working on California issues since 1980. Formerly editorial page editor for the Oakland Tribune and deputy editorial page editor of the Sacramento Bee, has served as deputy treasurer and policy director of the state's treasury and was policy director in 2006. Will you join me in welcoming our panel and moderator? Thank
you. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Russ. It's a pleasure to be here today with Joint Venture, and we hope that we can provide a little bit of light on what I know is, for most Californians, a very difficult and complicated ballot next month. Before I turn to our distinguished panelists, I want to take just a couple of minutes to indulge a prejudice I picked up when I did my graduate work in U.S. history up the road at Stanford. I didn't stick with history, but I can't get over the habit of believing sometimes you can better understand where you are if you know how you got there. So let's look at where California's state finances have been over the last 3 decades, since Proposition 13 transformed our state and the state's role in the state. As you can see here in the green line in this graph, California general fund spending, measured as a share of Californians' income, is lower today than it was 30 years ago. It has varied in a narrow range over the last 3 decades, swinging far less than the size of the federal budget, as you can see from the blue line at the top of the chart. So as fierce as they've been, our budget debates in California are quarrels over about 1 penny of the state's output. The biggest change we've seen over the last 30 years has been in California's priorities. In 1985, schools were the largest spending item, with higher education and health tied for second place. Here's the same chart for 2008. Schools are still at the top, and health is in second and has grown. A consequence of the inexorable rise of healthcare costs that's afflicting all of us. The big growth item, as you can see here, has been criminal justice, which is now 13% of the state budget, a reflection of the huge increase in the state's prison population. Its share of the budget now has passed higher education and social services and general government. If we were to use these budget priorities to infer the state's mission statement, you'd say that California job at state government is to educate, medicate, and incarcerate. To use a phrase that I've stolen from my friend David Osborne. The story on taxes is very similar. The state tax burden, the share of income that Californians pay to the state, has varied in a narrow range of about 1 penny. Again, you'll see much bigger swings in the federal tax burden, which is, is the blue line. In 2008, California's taxes as your share of personal income were at the same level as 1987. The biggest swings in the green line you see there come not from policy changes, from the 2 great asset bubbles of the last 30 years, the stock bubble and the housing bubble of the last decade, which yielded enormous revenues from capital gains. I suspect there's some people in the room who contributed mightily to that.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When you say state taxes, is that income, sales, property, all taxes?
All taxes to the state of California.
Okay.
But it's only the state,
Not
not local.
property.
Not local taxes.
Not property.
No, we're
Not
just
property.
we're dealing here with measures that deal with the state budget, so this is just the state. The partner would look very similar in this line because we cut property taxes deeply at the beginning of this period, 1978. We have low property taxes in California. Just as the composition of state spending has changed, so has the composition of state revenues. California's estate tax was repealed, as you see here, back in the 80s, and the residual revenue from the pickup tax disappeared early in this decade with the Bush tax cuts. The corporation income tax has been cut. There have been increases in both smoke taxes on cigarettes and on alcohol, but the changes in people's personal habits have more than offset the changes in those tax rates. The vehicle license fee, the so-called car tax, was raised in the early 90s when we had a budget crisis, and then was reduced at the end of that decade, and that change was cemented into law 2003 by Governor Schwarzenegger. Taxes on gasoline and other motor fuels have been raised twice, but because we have more fuel-efficient cars, the amount of revenue as a percentage of personal income has actually declined. And then there's the sales tax, which was raised also in the early 1990s crisis. But again, because of the changes in our habits, our sales tax applies almost exclusively to tangible goods. We, as consumers, have switched our purchasing to more towards services and intangible goods, such as we've replaced buying records and CDs with downloading songs from iTunes, which are not subject to sales taxes. So we've seen a decline in the percentage of personal income that's actually paid in sales taxes. So as you can see, as a result of both tax cuts and of changes in the economy, that a large proportion of the California tax base was whittled away during this period. And we would have seen an enormous budget problem, starting probably in the late 90s as a consequence of this, except for this. And this is the California income tax, which actually California income tax top rate is lower today than it was at the beginning of this period. But this is a period that's seen an enormous change in the share of income that goes to the people at the top of the economic pyramid. And those are people who are subject to the income tax. So
Mark, I'm sorry, you said that the rate is lower today than it was in 79?
Yes, the top rate was, we had 10 and 11% for top earners, and also we raised the child credit in 1997, 98. So taxes, as rates are lower, but the collections actually went up because of the shift in that. So.
When you say rich, what does that mean? It's over $1 million or 250,000?
Actually, about over most of the income is shifted. People make more than $400,000 a year. That's roughly where the top 1% starts in California and the nation as a whole. So here's a different view of the same trends, that you get a sense of where we've come over the last 30 years. When the bubble burst in 2001, California's structural deficit, which is a built-in imbalance between what it spends and what it takes in on normal years of taxes, was exposed. And this is the last 10 years. California's operating budget, you'll see in total over the last 10 years, California has spent $26 billion more than it took in tax revenues. And we've made up the difference largely through borrowing, partly in the general markets in 2004, and also internally borrowing from other accounts in state government. As a result, California now faces a double whammy. We have a structural deficit, and then we have had the effects of the recession. As you can see, in 2009 fiscal year, revenues have fallen off by 10%. And the alignment of these two deficits, structural and recession-driven, is the crisis that voters face on the May ballot. And before I turn this over to Lauren, just one more slide. Even if voters approve every measure in May, California still has big work to do to restore fiscal stability, as this projection for the legislative analyst shows. We have, even if everything passes on the May ballot, large and continuing built-in deficits in California. So with that as a prologue, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, and he's going to tell us how we're going to get out of this problem.
And I'm going to do it all without slides, which is really, really good because they look like crayons compared to what Mark put up there. Do I have a
Oh,
something
sure.
on my face. Maybe,
I mean,
maybe
let
you
me-
could turn that
I'll
off.
turn it
That would be great. Thank you.
Got like the bullseye in the
Well, it's
forehead.
It's hard enough for me. It's hard enough for me to hold an audience's attention without them trying to figure out what's going on with my face. Well, the trouble with doing an introduction like that is I have all sorts of things that I like. Other things I'd like to talk about. Like I'd like to argue with you about the sales tax on services, but I'm going to resist that. And at another New America Foundation joint venture Silicon Valley session, maybe we can do that. But anyway, thank you for coming here. Thanks for Joint Venture and New America for inviting me to talk about this. And I also appreciate the opportunity to go first. I get to both be a target, but also to set the table. And so I'm going to mostly talk about Proposition 1A. There's 6 measures on the ballot, and we can talk about all of them. That's really up to you. The one that's the most that's getting most of the attention, that I think is the most important, is going to have zero effect on that chart that Mark just showed you in the short term, but it's going to have a huge effect in the long term, and that's Prop 1A. It's fashionable, and because I say so, that Prop 1A has something for everybody to hate, and it does. And that all sides are unhappy, which must make it a good compromise. That's the cliche, and that's true too. It's also, you hear, especially from a few of the editorial boards that have endorsed it, kind of the classic, well, it's the good government impulse. They overcame their demons, and they came to the table, and everybody gave a little. They walked away with their heads high. Sure, that's what the editorial boards say. It was probably more likely it was a testament to everybody not wanting to go off the cliff. But really, it's more. Prop 1A is more than just an accumulation of offsetting negatives and good intentions. It's more than a sop to get 6 Republican votes to pass the budget. It really will have long-term positive consequences for California taxpayers and children, business owners and workers. And why is that? It's because it solves the problem that's at the heart of our budget difficulties for the past decade. Mark's charts understated the real problem of the California budget. His charts were all in terms of personal income, which in California during recovery or during good times is powerful engine. Personal income just cranks up during good times, and even though taxes go up more, income taxes, because we have such a progressive system, showing taxes as a percentage of personal income really understates the volatility. The income tax flies during good times. In the late 90s, it flew up before the end of the tech bubble. In the late 80s, there was this big bump, which caused something which we can talk about. We want to have another history lesson. After the tech collapse and the run up in the housing bubble, personal income flew. And then when it crashes, when we have recessions or when the bubbles burst in California, revenues collapse. And it's this volatility which is the real killer, because what happens is that we don't have a case in California where the legislature has gone out and raised taxes indiscriminately or even discriminately. Since Proposition 13, the legislature has not raised taxes permanently to increase programs. The only legislative tax increases, 2/3 vote, the only legislative tax increases since Prop 13 have been for emergencies like the Loma Prieta earthquake, or like this last year, to temporary increases to address the deficit. the other tax increases that we've seen in California that have actually increased programs with the tobacco tax, law enforcement, mental health, those have all been approved by the people. And with respect to the left, the problem hasn't been that we've been starving state programs by cutting taxes or enacting tax breaks. As Mark showed you, and I want to put an underline under this, for the past 30 years, general fund revenues in California have been remarkably steady at between about 6 and 7% of the state's economy. And so there has been a very steady, now that may not be enough for some people, it may be too much for other people, but there's been a steady commitment as a percentage of the economy of state revenues to state profits. The problem has been the volatility. The problem has been that revenues go up and down, and the legislature has been completely incapable of exercising any self-discipline when it comes to following those revenues. You know, it doesn't matter what bubble was, going all the way back, at least in my experience, back to 1980, 86, 87. Whenever there's, that was actually the one exception. That was the first experience we had with the bubble, and money actually went back to the taxpayers then. But ever since then, exactly. Otherwise, the legislature has spent every penny, and we've run into these deficits. And that's what's threatened both the taxpayers with the taxes that we had to increase, and with people who care about increasing state government, state programs when those programs have to be cut when there's a deficit. So Prop 1A, what Prop 1A does is that it directly attacks volatility. It is not a hard spending cap that my friend John Fleischman would like to see. It has aspects of a spending cap, but it's not a hard spending cap. It is geared toward smoothing the revenues. It doesn't allow you to spend every dollar every year, and I'm not saying Gene would want to do that, but it does. No, I'm serious. But I'm just trying to. It does, though, allow you to ultimately spend all the money that comes in to the Treasury. It may shift the spending from programs to, say, infrastructure or long-term obligations, but the money gets put into a reserve. It can eventually, under certain circumstances, be spent. So it is, in that sense, it's a compromise. It's not a hard spending cap, but it doesn't allow the legislature to spend every penny that it's able to in the past. So that is the kind of my opening shot. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details or some of the arcane history as much as that's where I like to live. And we could, but I'm happy to take some more good questions.
Good, thank you, Lauren. Jean?
Hi, thank you for inviting me to be here this morning. There is sort of hours of things already on the table to talk about, and this will be sort of a brief overview. And I'll do by way of disclosure, my organization has taken a formal no position on Prop 1A. We have no position on any of the other measures. This is only the third measure in our 15-year history that we have taken a position on, and my board takes very seriously and only judiciously does take a position, and we think this is such a serious measure that it deserves wholehearted opposition. A couple quick points, and looking forward to some back and forth. You will be sold as voters a package of measures and told that you have to vote them all up in order to save the state from going off a cliff on May 20th. Absolutely wrong. There are 6 measures. You should look at them independently. They all have different implications for California. They do different things. Prop 1A and 1B are connected. None of the rest of them are connected. So I would encourage you to look at them independently. And I think the key thing that I would point you to is actually Mark's last slide, showing what happens to budget shortfalls in California, even if all of these measures are approved by the voters. We are facing a cliff. We are looking at deeper and deeper deficits over the next 5 years, even if all of these measures are approved. And I think there's a key thing here that's extremely important in terms of the relationship between government, our elected officials, and the voters. You're about to see a lot of TV commercials. I've already started getting mail in my mailbox saying, vote for Prop 1A and it'll solve the state's budget problems. Absolutely wrong. And again, Mark's last slide shows you that. Proposition 1A, and I do agree with Lauren, it's important to focus on that because in a lot of ways that is the one that would have a lasting impact on California, other than Prop 1F, which says legislators don't get pay raises in bad budget years. None of the rest of the measures on the ballot would have a permanent impact. Prop 1A would have a permanent impact, so I think it does warrant the most attention. Does absolutely nothing to address the fundamental imbalance between revenues and expenditures in California. It will not solve our budget problems. The only way you solve a budget problem is you either raise revenues permanently, you cut spending permanently. Prop 1A doesn't do that. It does add a new spending obligation to the state's already autopilot formula-driven budget processes. That's a toughening up of the contributions to the rainy day fund requirement in the state contribution. Ironically, what Prop 1A does is it cuts in half the annual contribution into the state's true rainy day fund. Currently, we have 3% that goes into a rainy day fund. Prop 1A actually continues 3%, but then takes half that money and immediately transfers it into another pot, which if Prop 1B passes will go to education for 5 or 6 years, and after that would go for infrastructure. I would argue that there is an extremely strong hidden agenda in Prop 1A, which is to move money away from programmatic spending and into capital outlay, which one thing Mark didn't show you in his wonderfully beautiful slides is the fact that the other part of the budget that is growing at a rate faster than education, than health care, than any programmatic spending is what the state spends on capital outlay and debt service for infrastructure. So half the money that goes into the reserve immediately sort of pops out of the reserve and would go to feed that extraordinarily fast-growing part of the budget. And in fact, that's actually growing right now at a rate that actually exceeds criminal justice spending, which is hard to do in California. It's actually sort of taken the lead in terms of the fastest-growing part of the budget. Prop 1A, and I've been looking at public policies in California on taxation and budgeting for 20 years. It is wickedly complicated. I encourage you to read it. Unless you understand it, don't vote for it. I mean, seriously. Seriously, read every word and then turn to your mother, your spouse, your best friend, and try to explain it. If you can't do it, you shouldn't vote for it. And I mean that with all seriousness. I literally wake up. This is the sign that you need to get a life and go on vacation. In the middle of the night, saying, well, how does it interact with the most volatile part of the budget, which isn't personal income taxes, it's the sales tax on gasoline, aka the Prop 42 transfer. It leaves in place all of the existing formulas in the budget, which means that you're sort of, and it's got this sort of complicated three-bucket system of where money goes. And it leaves in place all of the existing formula-driven restrictions and earmarks in the budget. which has some really unintended and I think detrimental to the long-term fiscal future of California consequences when you layer on the new formulas with things like the Prop 42 transfer, the gasoline, which says the state has to make that program whole, and then when those revenues spike, has to divert part of those monies off into another fund. You end up double obligating your spending. We often hear about how the problem in California is that we have autopilot spending, we have formula-driven spending. The governor loves to talk about the problems with autopilot spending. Under Prop 1A, the amount that California can be spent will be determined by a linear regression of revenues over the last 10 years. I tell my friends this in other states. I say, we have this measure going to our ballot in May that literally will put the words linear regression in our state constitution. Talk about autopilot. You cannot get any more autopilot than you're using a regression line to predict what you're allowed to spend in California. Can go on and on and on this one. I would disagree with some of what Lauren said in terms of fiscal discipline. Over the past 15 years, legislators have approved about $12 billion in permanent tax cuts. In terms of the stability of our tax system, a lot of those cuts have been to taxes, provisions in our tax system that do make our revenues go up and down a little bit more in tough budget times. I would say that's the real discipline problem in California. In the past 6 months, in a time when we have a cumulative total of $65 billion of budget shortfalls, the legislature has enacted $2.5 billion of permanent tax cuts. All the tax increases are temporary, $2.5 billion of tax cuts. I would argue that that's the true discipline problem that we have in California. Other measures, I would just briefly flag Prop 1C, which would allow the state to borrow an unlimited amount of money against future lottery proceeds. You've probably heard a lot about $5 billion. Forget $5 billion as a cap. Prop 1C is a blank check. There are absolutely no limits on the amount of money that the state could borrow. The governor would have unilateral power to decide how much the state would borrow through a 5-member board, 3 of whom are appointees of the governor. So whether you like this governor, if you like this one, didn't like the last one, think about if the last one had been in power, or the next one. It would make some very, very significant changes to the way we finance education. Again, we can get into what are the right inflation adjustments. Prop 1C has a set of inflation adjustment factors that grow at a faster rate than Prop 1A. So when you put the two together, you end up with a Pac-Man eating up the state budget. Ask me some questions. I'd be happy to explain on that one. And I guess I would end on Prop 1C. It's a hunting license. And again, I wake up and this really is I need to get a new life. I think the real hidden agenda, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, or maybe I'm sort of a conspiracy theorist. I think what's really driving a lot of the intensity around this election is Proposition 1C. It is the one that has the major impact on where the state budget stands on May 20th. There are $6 billion worth of solutions in the budget. Prop 1C is currently scored at a $5 billion solution, which is a wonderful Sacramento word for something that you use to score towards balancing your budget. Prop 1D, which would divert some tobacco tax funds for 5 years, is about $600 million. Prop 1E is about $260 million a year for 2 years. I personally think that the lottery is the weak link. It's the weak link for a lot of different reasons. But if that passes, My bet is that you will see that $5 billion solution grow to $10, $15 billion sometime between May 19th and June 1st. Because when you look at how do you get out of the shortfalls, again, that Mark talked about, we have cut so deeply. I think getting the requisite 2/3 vote for a tax increase again in a very short period of time is highly, highly unlikely. And I would just end by saying I think all of us should think about how do you feel about a plug number. Bonds the state probably will never sell. But if they are sold are predicated on encouraging Californians to spend twice as much as they currently spend buying lottery tickets at a time when we're facing record foreclosures, record demand on food banks, record distress among families in California. Lots to talk about.
Thank you, Jean. And I'll turn it over to John. I'm going to do a linear impression of same revenues for the last 5 years. Go ahead.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I won't talk about the travails of United Airlines yesterday, but suffice it to say that I spent a lot of my day in John Wayne Airport in Orange County yesterday. But I did make, and I especially wanted to thank Joe for giving me a call and asking me to be here. I think we're going to create a tough situation for Joe because with Jean on one end and me on the other end, both coming to the same conclusion, albeit in some cases for different reasons.
Very different reasons.
Same reason.
We're gonna force Joe to have to kind of stake out the center position, which, while he does that on occasion, actually he prefers to bounce back and forth. So good luck. I guess the first thing I would say is that I was invited here because I have a website on California politics, which is conservative in its leanings. But also, as of last Saturday, I conveniently get to wear my other hat, which is as a regional vice chairman of the state Republican Party, which came out against all 6 of the ballot propositions. And the first thing I would say is, and I will recognize that it's likely if we did a show of hands, I probably wouldn't win the class president election here today. But that may not be the case. That's the Bay Area, typically not the bedrock of republicanism, although I did go to San Jose State right around the corner, so I'm not too far from home. My position, the position of the party, my position is that, and this is my first of many opportunities to agree with Jean. The number one reason to oppose this package that's in front of you is that it does not solve the problem. As Jean pointed out, as Mark pointed out, regardless of what happens with the ballot measures on the election, which starts now and goes through May 19th, and I think it's important to note, by the way, that it's likely in a low turnout May special election that a majority of the votes that will be cast are going to be cast by absentee ballot election day. It's kind of this whole idea that the election's off on May 19th. That's the last day to vote, but people are voting right now. And the problem is, not only do these ballot measures not solve the problem, but you have to look at what causes the problem. This is where I will not diverge from Jean. We have a problem because our legislative majority in Sacramento spends, well, I agree with Lauren, spends without any regard for sustainable level of income. And now we end up in a situation where all of the Democrats in Sacramento with the governor and the 6 legislative Republicans, not only did they pass massive tax increases when we're in a recession, which is of course the worst time to get hit with tax increases, but then on top of it, Jean would argue a recession is the worst time to have government cuts. So to give her that side. In addition to that, however, they have taken what potential good there would be on the May 19th ballot, which is the revenue smoothing measure that Lauren talked about, and coupled it with another $16 billion of taxes. And this starts to become one of those situations where I'm sure many of you here have heard that phrase, garbage in, garbage out. Well, this is what happens when you have a flawed budget process. Again, a point of agreement between Jean and I. We both agree the budget process is terrible. I think everybody at this table would agree that anytime you have a system where you're going to take 120 grown adults, maturity levels questionable, but 120 grown adults, shove them into the Capitol and say, you're going to stay here, locked in here, under gunpoint, or theoretical gunpoint, because these legislative sergeant-at-arms have peace officer powers, and you may not leave until we pass this plan. oh, and by the way, we're going to strategically call a floor session to deprive you of REM sleep, so that these very complicated state matters will not only need to be forced upon you, but you will be like bleary-eyed and unable to figure out what you're doing is the wrong way to run state government. And so what you get is this situation where it's almost like a budget process that is geared towards a solution rather than the right solution. And whether you believe that right solution is increasing state revenues, or whether you believe that that right solution is decreasing state spending, the way that the system is set up now, it tries to force compromise if automatically, if everybody is sharing and sacrifice, the result is a good product. And I would actually submit to you that what we have today is the worst of all possible situations, because what you have is tax increases in a recession, bad idea, and as I miraculously saw through some of Mark's charts, you actually have situations where when tax rates drop, state revenues increased, and that's important to remember because the opposite is also true. If you increase the tax rates, the revenues will drop, and I believe, and many in the legislature believe, that as a result of these tax increases, you're actually going to see lower revenues come into the state. But here's the inherent problem you have with the proposal that came out, was, at least from the perspective of those of us who are Republicans who saw the deal come together, is we believe, now this may put me on a different track with Gene again, we believe that the public employee unions in California are a major part of the problem. We believe that the vast millions and millions of dollars that are invested by those unions into political campaigns end up electing to the legislature people who are unwilling to acknowledge that perhaps during a recession, when the private sector is going through significant periods of downsizing, significant periods of right-sizing, significant challenges to stay afloat, not only is state government not making any cuts in their personnel, but actually if you were to look and track all the way through, there was a, Joe probably knows who did this study, but I remember I tracked all the way through last February, I think it was the Sacramento Bee, the state workforce has actually increased, not decreased. And so you get this situation where state government is growing, and so then you say, okay, then Republicans say, okay, what do we want? We want the GAN cap back, but we can't get that. So we're going to argue and say, what can we get in return for increasing taxes? And this is where you get the fundamental problem. We want this revenue smoothing measure, which, by the way, I'm all in favor of the idea of revenue smoothing, although I'm not a big fan of this ballot budgeting by initiative that we've done. Frankly, the legislature should grow up and smooth themselves. The people shouldn't have to enact all of these arcane formulas to do that. I support a supermajority for raising taxes, but beyond that, I really think we ought to get rid of all the balloting, budget bug balloting. But here's the problem, is that in order to get the spending smoothing measure, as modest as it is compared to a spending cap, accommodations were reached with the public employee unions, so that by the time you are done, many people that I hold to be in high esteem, who have track records of being policy experts in the area of spending limits or smoothing measures, don't agree with Lauren's assessment that this is an effective smoothing measure. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody does, but Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, National Tax Limitation Committee, Pacific Research Institute, there was an editorial from Steve Moore on the pages of the Wall Street Journal. They may be right, they may be wrong. Lauren's the policy guy, I'm the politics guy. But one of the things I look for in policy, from a political point of view, is who are the leaders in a policy area, and do they all agree or do they disagree? And if they disagree, then you have to back up and say, what would be the cause of disagreement? And this, you know, Lauren was probably waiting for this, but this becomes one of the most insidious problems that we have with this particular budget deal. As we all know, you know, many groups and many organizations are represented by lobbyists in Sacramento. And unfortunately, a lot of people aren't represented by lobbyists in Sacramento. And so one of the problems with this particular budget deal is, you know, and I can say this as a Republican, the big business community, and by the way, there is no sector of California's business in California that I don't believe couldn't be made better with some tax cuts and regulatory relief to spur our economy. But what you've got is a budget deal where at the same time that working Californians, I get into my little class warfare, maybe Gene will like this. Working Californians are getting hit with income tax increases, car tax increases, sales tax increases that are getting hit broadly, although that might argue against the spikes because then everyone, you know, everyone's paying. In the very same budget deal, big business is getting over $1 billion in targeted tax breaks. And again, understand, business probably needs those breaks. California is not competitive as it should be in the business climate. But you can't get away from an optic of, I'm going to walk over to your pocket, Ellen, and I'm going to take $1,000 out of your pocket this year. I'm going to go drop off, $50 with Intel, $50 with Chevron, because they got deals out of the budget, and then the rest we're going to put in the state coffers. And then it, leaves you in a challenging situation where normally the Chamber of Commerce would be out there saying tax increases are a bad idea, and it leaves me wondering, would the Chamber of Commerce have supported this package if instead of $1 billion plus in targeted tax relief for businesses, say the income tax revenues were reduced by that same $1.5 billion? And so, it's like Steve Poizner, our insurance commissioner, likes to say it on the stump. If you don't have a lobbyist in the game in Sacramento, sometimes you're in big trouble. And, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is probably the closest thing there is to a citizen lobbying effort. And they got one guy up there. And so it really, tends to be a tough deal. I've talked too long, so I will simply say that Jean is right on Proposition 1C. Again, I'm going to cause her to go back to the office and restudy her notes. It's absolutely, and her last point, by the way, is very correct. I don't know how many people in here think that it's good public policy to balance your books on state-sponsored gambling, most specifically in a situation where the lottery, in fact, does target the most needy of people and the people who can least afford to be buying lottery tickets for that little dream of the winning ticket. Although I noticed that last week's $1 million winner was in Newport Beach. So, I wonder how many tickets that guy buys every week. He may be funding half the state's budget for solution. And then since nobody's talked about 1F, I will bring this up as a way of kind of putting a period on the end of the sentence of my long remarks here. Proposition 1F, I don't know how many of you guys followed the budget process very closely. I told you garbage in, garbage out. Well, when we sat there at the end of the day and, Republicans in the state Senate were voting, the state Senate was voting on the tax increase part of the package. They came up short on their votes, and Abel Maldonado, who's rather notorious, he's a Republican on the Central Coast, but we like to put the R in quotes, because we're not quite sure exactly if he has a governing ideology. I don't think he does. But at the very end, he basically says, well, I'll support the taxes, and then he brings out his little private laundry list over lunch with the governor at Spataro and says, these are the things I want. I want an open primary. I want 1F. It was one of these kind of blackmail demands. It is the least impactful, it like does nothing. And I will only use it in this analogy. If you were to take the big salary that Mark here gets at the New America Foundation, and you were to say next year, if the New America Foundation doesn't make a profit, which is funny because it's a nonprofit, but if the New America Foundation doesn't make a profit, next year Mark won't get a raise. Wow, maybe Mark wouldn't get a raise next year anyway if the economy is bad. And so it's really this nonsensical situation, which actually is part of this philosophy of this kind of populist movement to say if the budget isn't on time, the legislature shouldn't get paid. And again, that's part of the same root problem that we have in Sacramento now. Driving towards a solution at all costs, whether the solution is good or bad. And I would submit whether you're a liberal Democrat who is not voting for an out-of-whack budget because you don't believe it has enough tax increases, or whether you're a conservative Republican who believes that the budget spends too much and you don't want to put more tax increases. Either way, measures that penalize the entire legislature, including the minority votes, whether they're on the right or the left, for failed budgeting by the majority, those are bad public policy and should be rejected. So, anyways, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And so we've had a couple of conspiracy theories laid on the table, Joe, but I just want you to spell third to that word, which is the only reason Arnold put these on the ballot is to promote the vac sales of your book.
No.
Does it have that effect?
That's not it. He and I had a conversation about that about a week and a half ago. Not the case. I'll get into the lesser of evils argument for 1A and 1B. Maybe in Q&A. I want to do very quickly so there's time for questions. But I want to talk about some of the down ballot things: 1C, 1D, and 1E. 1C is the lottery borrowing measure that Gene referenced. 1D is a measure that asks voters to take about $1.6 billion over 5 years in tobacco tax money that you voted 11 years ago with Prop 10 in 1998 to devote to early childhood programs 0 to 5 and puts that back into the general fund. And then Prop E raids voter-approved money as a millionaire sort of surcharge tax that was approved by voters as Prop 63 in 2004 and puts that back in the general fund. That's about $530 million or so over 2 years. Now, to think about these things, and let me give you a frame that you can think about it, the really, why are these things on there? Well, they're on there because of you. And these three, and the best sort of understanding, the thing you should take into, the wisdom you should take into the ballot box, into the voting booth when you make this decision, is the wisdom of a noted California taxpayer named Dr. Dre, who in the song, wonderful song, California Knows How to Party, referred to our state as a state that's untouchable like Elliot Ness. And I thought a lot about that particular lyric because it actually, I think what he's talking about there is our system of direct democracy. We have the most rigid, untouchable system of ballot initiatives anywhere in the world. When we pass something by ballot initiative, no one can go back and change it but the voters, whether it's a statute or a constitutional amendment. The reason we have 1C on the ballot, why the legislature needs your permission to do things to lotteries, because the lottery was created by ballot initiative 25 years ago. One of the great bits of political entrepreneurial activity ever, a company that makes lottery machines, well actually a guy who gathers signatures for a living went to a company that makes lottery machines and pitched him on the whole idea so he would have, you know, some volume of signatures that got on the ballot anyway. So to make changes in the lottery, you need that change, you need that modernization. That's where 1C comes from and why you're being asked to do it. One thing to think about 1C that Gene didn't add, and I actually have this similar worry about 1C, 1D, and 1E. Everyone says, well, this is where the money, there's money in these things that goes back, that goes into the general fund. This helps us, and certainly it's true in the short term. In the long term, I fear with all of them that the costs will outweigh the benefits. 1C, the lottery doesn't provide all that much money for education. It's less than 2% of education spending in the state. 1C protects the sort of level we're currently at. It means that, you know, the small amount of money that schools are getting and community colleges are getting from the lottery is protected. That level is backfilled. But again, that means that, you know, there's actually new spending in the thing, and if in the long run, that's a new obligation, new budget costs. So that covers 1C. Now to 1D and 1E, where we're rating these voter approved initiatives. Now, you say, all right, that helps the general fund temporarily. Here's the problem. There's been a lot of talk about ballot box budgeting and the evils of having voters do that. And I generally agree with that, but there's good, for the sake of, there's good ballot box budgeting and there's bad ballot box budgeting, okay? Now, most initiatives are bad ballot box budgeting. They make some sort of claim on the Treasury, either a sort of mandate that, you know, without there being specific funds there to pay it back. Oftentimes that's a general obligation bond. You see with stem cell research or children's hospitals. Other times it's a mandate. A lot of tough on crime measures essentially create huge costs for the state without being paid for. That's bad ballot box budgeting. That's most ballot initiatives. The reason why most ballot initiatives don't have a particular, you know, revenue stream is because that would be a tax or a fee, and that would make the thing harder to pass. There are rare good ballot box budgeting is when you actually identify funding streams, revenue streams, attach a tax to whatever program you're starting. And as it happens, the two measures we're seeking to undo in part with 1D and 1E, are on the good side. They were Prop 10 and Prop 63, which each had tax, you know, had funding streams, taxes attached to them. Both narrowly won. They were tough sells in part because of the tax. And so we're targeting those measures. Now, why are we targeting those measures? Well, because that's where the money is. They actually have money attached. They are being punished. The backers of those two programs are being punished for their responsibility, for being fiscally responsible. They're the target. We are punishing the more responsible initiative sponsors. Now, what is the impact of this? Well, from talking to a lot of people political consultants and especially election lawyers who write initiatives, have always been reluctant to advise anyone to attach a tax to their initiative. And this, everyone I talk to says, we will never again suggest that anyone be fiscally responsible in writing an initiative. I mean, there's no point in it. I mean, one of the arguments for doing things this way was that if you could get through the ballot, you would at least have the money there be for certain. But we now see that in tough budget times, you become a target. Your pool of money becomes a target. So you'll never see, I think we've seen the last fiscally responsible ballot initiative again. Now, there's a way to fix this. In fact, little story, and this is how it all lined up. There was a Senate Constitutional Amendment 4, which has bipartisan backing. Authors are Denise DeShaney, Roy Ashburn, would require every initiative to essentially be self-funding, that any cost created by it would have to be, before something could go on the ballot, the legislative analyst and the director of finance would have to say, this funds itself. There's money for it. But in one of life's little ironies, SCA 4 became the vehicle for a gut and amend. That's in Sacramento when they're in a big rush. They don't want to have hearings on a bill. They gut out the contents of another bill and put in something else. Well, SCA 4 was gut and amended into the open primary measure, which was part of Abel Maldonado's price, and that went on the ballot in 2010. So it's reappeared now as SCA 14. I think 1D and 1E would be much easier to swallow, and actually, I think a much better thing if part of the package had been, well, I would like a seventh measure, which is a measure that said, initiatives have to be self-funding. Future initiatives have to be self-funding, but by like 1D and 1E, but they didn't do that. Anyway, let me stop there.
Thank you, Joe. Excuse me, in light of what's in the clock, I'm going to sort of forego my questions. I have a bunch of them for yours. I want to give all of you a chance to ask your questions to panelists and make statements if you like. Go ahead.
The question I have is, I've heard all about from you, no on 1A, no on all, all this, but you have no solution to present. I like to see from Republican Party what exactly are they going to balance the budget or how they're going to solve the California crisis, rather than give them, after all these ballots are rejected, absolute power to negotiate over the legislature. I like to see Gene say, yes, this is all the program that need to be cut, this is where the tax needs to be increased. Because, I mean, it's easy to sit here. Politics is politics. They are negotiating on politics over there. If we are going to say, well, we don't like you, we want to watch you out, we should want them out and get a completely new legislature that will do something for us. Otherwise, at least we need to go back and say, all right, this is how the solution is. And nobody here is showing a solution. It's just a no say. And that's where I really have a problem.
Prop 1A has no impact on the budget deficit. Let's just be clear. It does not raise tax. I mean, there are the 2 years of temporary taxes linked to it that are out in the future, but it doesn't cut spending, or beyond that, the temporary extension play a role in increasing revenue. So C, D, and E do have dollars attached. I think in C it's questionable, and I agree with Joe that we believe, and we have an analysis on our website that I think points to the fact that there will be long-term net costs for exactly the reasons Joe said on Prop 1C. I would look back again to the $12 billion a year of tax cuts in California. I think the fundamental problem in the rules around our budget problem is the fact that California is the only state in the nation that requires more than a majority to both pass a budget and increase any state taxes. 3 states have a 2/3 under any circumstances for passing a budget. 12 states have more than a 2/3 for any state tax increase. We are the only one that's at the intersection of those two. We are the biggest state, the most diverse state. I think that is fundamentally what makes California ungovernable, particularly when you, and I think Joe did a great job of sort of walking through the history of ballot box budgeting. When you then allow the voters to mandate spending on stem cell research without a revenue source, or children's hospitals, or 3 strikes, pick your program, I think it makes the state ungovernable. I don't know where we go from here, and I think the solutions are incredibly tough. I actually think that I am not irrevocably opposed to borrowing. What California did that was just unfathomably stupid was borrow money in 2004 when the economy was going up, which is when we should have increased taxes and got our budget into balance. Instead, we borrowed money that we're now paying $2.5 billion a year in debt service on. I think this is the time when, and I'm trained as an economist, that you would want to look towards potentially borrowing. The lottery is probably the most expensive loan. It is the governmental equivalent of going to a payday lender. What we should have done was go back and borrow more of the deficit bonds, such as the voters authorized in 2004, when we shouldn't have borrowed that money, which is a cheap loan, because it's secured by a sales tax rate for a whole bunch of reasons. It's a good revenue source, a solid revenue source. It doesn't have all the funky stuff that the lottery does attributed. But basically because the governor isn't willing to go back to the well that he said he'd never go back to again, we're going to be paying hundreds of millions of dollars a year in excess interest costs, so that the governor basically can save face. I think there's something so fundamentally wrong with that. I think when you're in this depths of an economic downturn, there are better ways to borrow, but given the cuts that were made in February, the tax increases done in February, I don't think borrowing would be the end of the world. I think we shouldn't have done it earlier this decade.
John, would you address the question of
Sure.
where you would cut? You say, spend, you don't want the taxes. Where, in light of, the California, what we do is educate, medicate, and incarcerate for the most part. Where's the gift?
Yeah. To answer that question, I would say 2 things. First, part of my answer is very political, because I would say that the voters of California have decided to let the Democrats be the majority party in the legislature. So I would argue this is a largely Democrat-created problem. The Democrats need to come up with a solution or elect a Republican majority to then have responsible governance for California. I throw that out first as a very political answer, but I sincerely believe it. It's one of my problems with balloting measures is every time the voters are frustrated with what the far left does in the legislature, they rectify it through a ballot measure instead of changing the composition of the legislature. But I would simply argue that the first step, number 1, is, and this was not done in this budget crisis, is stop anything in state government, whether through ballot measure or through legislation, that does any automatic increases of anything. Every decision that government should spend more on a program, whether it's a cost of living adjustment, whether it's anything, should be an affirmative action taken by the legislature, taking into account the financial consequences of doing that. That's number 1. Pension reform is a big issue, but does not impact today's dollars. Once you get to a situation where you could say, if we deal with the shortfall, we won't have these massive automatic growing of state government, then you could start to look into issues like, where's all the surplus state property, the selling of the San Quentins. California has billions and billions and billions of dollars in property. Former Congressman Tom Campbell has this theory that as soon as the May 19 ballot props go down, somebody's going to come up with the bright idea of selling every state building to the private sector and then leasing them back. And in doing so, getting rid of this big, huge state asset. I don't think that's a good idea. But it's a better idea than raising taxes in an economy which will actually cause a decrease in state revenues, in my opinion. So, again, where are the solutions? When this budget negotiation took place, the courts had not ruled that the governor has an ability to require all state employees to go all the way down to potentially down to minimum wage level, which I think brings the unions back to the table. Lord, don't ask me why the governor has approved a new contract. It's still subject to ratification by the legislature for SEIU that has in the language of it, there shall be no layoffs for the next 2 years. This is a true story. And so at the end of the day, the solution is going to involve downsizing the state's workforce. I'm perfectly willing to look at ways to figure out how to make our prison system more cost effective. Through privatizing, I'm willing to look at what we do with nonviolent offenders. I'm not saying that every Republican is willing to do that. And of course, you know, everybody keeps associating how much money you throw at our education system with how good it is. And the reality is, I think Californians should stop throwing as much money statewide at education, and also then, at the same time, free up the local districts to do what they want with the money they have, instead of the state education code that's this big, huge volume that says, okay, you may have no money for your books in your classroom, but guess what? The categorical that makes sure you've got great, beautiful lights on your hockey field is fully funded, and you can go ahead and fund that. So there's no easy solutions, but I would say that the biggest solution would be to elect a Republican majority and have some responsible heads.
So they can take down the country like Bush did.
I'm not an advocate of George W. Bush. I thought he was a terrible
The problem
president.
is, rather than working together as a minority party to try to do something with your Republican governor, you are just being no say.
No. I'm not saying I'm not saying that there are common sense solutions, but a tax increase is not a common sense solution in good economic times. Let alone, I mean, we're looking at you guys can tell me because you know this. What's the unemployment in the Bay Area? Like 11%. You're now asking 11% of people to pay $1,100 more in taxes a year when they have no job. I mean, if that isn't dumb economic policy, I don't know what is. So I'll just throw that out there.
Lauren, you wanted to?
Well, I just wanted to maybe twist squat a little bit. And I guess I'd like to be a defender of democracy here. The ballot box budgeting, all of these initiatives, the bond measure, the spending on infrastructure that Gene was pointing out, these were all voted on by the people. I think we need to respect that. We may disagree with them. We may think the lottery is a lousy. I think the lottery is a lousy idea. I don't much like Prop 98, which puts school spending in concrete. But I respect those and respect that the people made those decisions, and you need to go back to the people to see if they change their minds, and that they're no longer, that these measures are no longer the ownership of the initiative sponsors. I disagree that you're sort of that somehow by going back to the people and asking them to change propositions D and E, that you're somehow breaking faith with the initiative sponsors. To hell with them. I don't care about the initiative sponsors anymore. Those become the property of the people because the people voted for them, and you have to go back and ask the people whether they're going to be changed. And the only thing that's different, the hypocrisy is too strong a word, but it's just sort of a weird double standard, an understandable double standard, but a weird double standard. And that is that we're paying attention to Prop D and E, to tobacco tax, and the mental health money. The only reason we're doing that is because they were ballot measures. Do you have any idea the kinds of budget cuts that were done by the legislature? We have cut support for aged, disabled, and blind. We have eliminated a bunch of Medi-Cal benefits and cut the Medi-Cal reimbursements. We've cut the hell out of schools. They're going to get it back, but in the short term, they're suffering. Colleges and universities it's all over the board. But we're not talking about that here because the legislature did it. They did their job. They cut the budget. But we're talking about D&E because it's something the people did, and somehow that's elevated. Well, it's something that you have to go back and you have to make your case to the people because the people own it. But it doesn't mean that there's somehow more worthy in the scheme of things than.
I want to just jump in on that. I tend to agree with you on actually probably sympathize with you on all of these measures. I mean, my problem with D&E is they have long-term costs because we'll have more money. All ballot initiatives will be irresponsible. Everything will be a bond, and that'll create longer-term budget costs. But to answer your question, I mean, these are all terrible, but it's a classic lesser evil case where in the short term, I think we're probably better off, with the package than we are without the package. I think folks on the left and the right don't have any viable short-term alternative. I mean, there's a lot of fantasy you'll hear. I read on John's blog, I read on liberal blogs like Politics about how in the left things we're going to do this majority vote thing and push through what we want that way. I don't think that's real. I think every lawyer I know says that it's not going to get anywhere in the courts. People on the right think there's all these places to cut. I would submit that while there are places to cut, there aren't nearly enough. I mean, you could fire every state worker and you still wouldn't cover the deficit. So I mean, there's a lesser evil. But what the fact that it's such a bad package and we probably need it really makes the argument for bigger long-term reforms, changes in 2/3. I would throw in initiative reform and big changes in how we budget. But we're in something of a crisis here. So I think the crisis should drive that conversation. But I don't think you can get to those changes in time to deal with the immediate crisis.
Yeah. So being here in Silicon Valley, one of the things that's unique about this place is that we're very focused on people rather than processes. So when I hear these discussions, I kind of hear people say, well, if you would just trust us, like trust the majority of Democrats or trust the minority of the Republicans or trust the legislature. But I think the reason we have this mess is because we don't trust each other. We don't trust you guys. We don't trust the experts. We don't trust the media. And because of that, there's two ways to respond to that. And one is to respond with more bureaucracy, more rules, more convoluted, arcane things. And, and we can say that's good or bad, but it seems like unless, in Silicon Valley, the way we try to innovate our way out of horrible problems is coming up with ways that small groups of people can trust each other to deliver something unique of value in a simple system that scales up. And that's at least how I've seen it work in the business world. And has anyone thinking about how to do that? And do they realize that there's a crisis of trust? We don't trust any of you people,
Of course.
and that something needs to be done about it. And has any of you how to do that?
Yeah, but the difference between Silicon Valley and Sacramento is that yeah, that's right. It's the weather. That's it. No, the difference is that you're operating in a non-ideological environment, and you're operating.
Have you ever seen a Mac versus PC yet?
Well, okay, but those are opportunities. But those are opportunities for creative competition and trying to
satisfy the customer.
And trying to satisfy.
Which doesn't exist in government.
Well, no. I mean, in an ideological context, you're aiming toward a very narrow part of the market. In those terms, the Democrats and the Republicans are gearing their arguments toward they're responding in the legislature to a very, very, very narrow part of the market. And kind of as John alluded to, there aren't the people only have a say when it comes to the ballot. The people really don't have much of a say when it comes to the legislature because of the very narrow focus there. Which is why I think that we really have to respect the ballot measures. It is a safety valve for people. It's initiative reform to me is code for making it harder for the people to respond in initiatives, and I think that elites like that. Elites like to keep the people in the distance, and I just think that's a mistake.
I'm going to come in, and I think, and I'm going to disagree with John, even though we've agreed on some various things. I think because we do have this double 2/3, it isn't a partisan problem in Sacramento, because we have as long as we have a system that says, or unless one party can go out and get 2/3, it is a problem of the legislature as a whole, and everybody needs to own the problem. They need to be responsible. I think that is unworkable, and I think I would agree with Warren that you have a relatively non-ideological, somewhat more homogenous outlook in terms of politically, economically, geographically. When you look at California, the vastness and diversity in every dimension of California, how you expect to get 2/3 of the people or their representatives to agree is just mind-boggling. When you look at it, if you array by population the 12 states that have the 2/3 vote for any state tax increase, and I always forget the population goes back and forth. It's California at about 37, 38 million people. The next one, I always forget whether it's Colorado or Washington State, both of which are about 6 million people. I would say they are one city states. You got Denver, you got Cavs. You got Seattle, you got trees. I mean, I'm a Californian, but no, I mean, seriously, here you have San Jose, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Redding, Barstow, and everything
So you're arguing for partition?
And on some level, it's like, where's Stan Statham when we need him? Who wanted to split the state into 3. I think we either have to admit that if we are going to stay together as a state, we can't allow a very small minority to dig in, and rewrite whole bodies of law in the middle of the night, as the price for solving a tremendous budget problem. I mean, to disagree with Lauren, and I think sort of agree back to where Joe was saying in terms of the ballot box. The problem there is that we allow anybody, I think the price now is probably more, it used to be about $1 million to get something on the ballot. Now it's probably about up to, I was going to say 2. We allow GTEC, which is the primary donor in favor of Prop 1C, to go to a petition gatherer, put the lottery on the ballot, and then sell it as money for schools, money for whatever. We essentially allow anyone with a spare $2 million to use the state's taxing powers to do whatever they want to do. And then as voters, we get mad when politicians can't balance the budget. I mean, I spoke to an Orange County PTA, which is one of my favorite groups of people, seriously, in the state. They're phenomenally dedicated parents who take 3 days a year out to come to Sacramento and talk to lawmakers. They're like, why do I have to vote on 1D and 1E? And I said, exactly, because you put it into law to begin with. But, and I agree, those at least had funding sources. Stem cells, Children's Hospital, whole host of other stuff. Jessica's Law, 3 strikes. No consequences. It's you get dessert, you don't eat your vegetables. At this point, it's a real problem. And that's what drives a lot of our budget
So this
process.
is where I disagree, is that I completely agree that the initiative system is broken, the 2 thing is a bad idea, but those are symptoms of the fact that we do not trust the legislature.
I agree.
I haven't seen anyone trying to address that issue.
It's because, but I think part of the trust
But you think it's because we don't trust Republicans, but they're the problem, you guys are the problem.
I think we have no lines of clear accountability right now, and I think that if you are, people look and they say Democrats control the majority. The Democrats can't pass a budget, they can't pass a tax increase. We cannot hold people accountable because the majority doesn't have the controlling power to make public policy.
Here's part 2 of political reform. Part 1 was last November, Prop 11, which changed the reapportionment system to make it, to take it out of the hands of the self-dealing legislature. Okay, that's part 1, but that's only a small part because most of the state, Democrats tend to live with Democrats, Republicans tend to live with Republicans. There's not a whole lot of swing districts. This is part 2. This is the open primary that John's friend Abel Maldonado leveraged to get on the June of 2010 ballot. And it will basically have a nonpartisan primary in California for the legislature and for statewide offices. I don't think there's one. But this will basically, in these partisan districts, which are naturally partisan, I'm not saying they're necessarily self-governed, in these partisan districts where inevitably you would wind up, if you won the primary as a Democrat or Republican, you would be elected as a Democrat or Republican. It would permit the top 2 vote getters, no matter the party, to run off in the general election, and that provides much more access by voters in these districts to have a truly competitive election between people that are going to be from the same party. So there are ways of getting at this. The parties, the Democrats, the Republicans, are going to raise the roof over this thing, because they see this as diluting their power, and it will. But this is a step toward establishing the trust and the relationship and the accountability between people and their elected representatives.
First of all, I wanted to thank you, because I came in today not knowing too much about what came in the mail yesterday. So I want to thank you for explicating this. To me, this is a very bizarre election, because everyone has said pretty much that the issues that have been brought forward to help us solve the crisis that we're in won't solve the crisis. No, I haven't seen any chart as to how bad it'll be if they aren't passed. But anyway, these aren't solutions to the problem that we're in. They're just being presented to us. And when you look at who's in favor and who's against, it's a hodgepodge of odd bedfellows. You have, big business and the labor unions are in favor, and you've got left and right wing, special interest groups are equally opposed. And so it's kind of like not the normal allies that are lining up, and so it's a very confusing election to me. I guess the point I wanted to make actually was the one that Lauren just made at the very end, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense. I mean this kind of in a clinical sense maybe, and that is that just as they say that an alcoholic has to hit bottom, before they actually begin to deal with the root problems, I also almost look at this election, this weird election where we're being asked to go to the ballot box for non-solutions to problems that have really deep root causes, as being maybe a sign of just how ill our political system is, and how much we are in need of real fundamental reform. And I agree. I think there's kind of three elements of fundamental reform. There was redistricting reform, which we got. There's the open primary and campaign finance reform. These seem to me kind of at a deep, deep level, the kind of things that we need if we want to try to crawl out of the problems that we have. And these Band-Aids that don't even quite cover the wound, I think are more of a sign of how much we need the more fundamental fixes than they are actually, important in of themselves. So I just offer that as an offer. I do want to thank you, because I understand it better now.
Yeah, okay. Just one correction. Labor actually split on this, partly along the lines that, they, if I could be crude about it, they bought CTA. I mean, CTA is exempted from any of the consequences of long-term of whatever we do with the spending cap. So, that was done because CTA, had they not done it, would have been able to kill this.
It was less of a cartoon than that, though. There was a legitimate, it's arcane, but it's important, legitimate debate over how much the state's obligation would be to education as a result of these big budget cuts. Prop 98 gives them some guarantee.
Yes, the teachers.
Yes, I'm sorry, the teachers. And there's a legitimate dispute, which I happen to think the CTA was right on, and the governor and the legislature was wrong on. But the CTA agreed to come to the table and not litigate this, and instead to do a compromise, which does actually save money for a couple of years. Postpone any repayment that they would get for a couple of years. Whereas if they went to court and won, they get that repayment as soon as the Prop 98 formula goes into effect. So I think there was it was a compromise that was agreed to by CTA. CTA supports 1A and 1B. The state labor unions oppose 1A, and many of the private sector labor unions, especially construction trades, support 1A.
And California Federation of Teachers, which is a smaller teachers union, opposes 1A.
And I would say groups like the League of Women Voters, California Council of Churches, California School Boards Association also oppose Prop 1A. So I think it's not fair to characterize it as sort of, the far left, far right. I would say sort of the League, which historically has been sort of the gold standard in terms of organizations that look at public policies.
We can't classify it as confusing.
I want to deconfuse the political lines, because I think they're very interesting, very clearly drawn. I think that we are now very much in Arnold Schwarzenegger's California. Because what essentially he has done is, I think, what is sort of the centrist dream. He's divided the left, union labor is divided, and he's divided people, Republicans on the right. And he's got sort of centrist pragmatists from both sides with him. And this is post-partisanship. My goodness. And the thing about it is, and I'm deeply sort of ideologically sympathetic to that. The problem is, and the question is, does it get you anywhere? Can you govern from the center? And I think what we're seeing is you can't actually govern from the center. These things are very likely to fail. Now, you can kind of explain the political lines here, and I've tried to do it 3 ways. One is it's elected officials versus bases. You've got more pragmatic elected officials at war with their bases. The Republican governor and the Republican Party is for these things. The Republican Party is against it. You've got Democratic legislative leaders for these things. They negotiated them, and you're about to see the Democratic Party probably go against them this weekend. So you have that divide. Then you have the divide of the sort of center versus the extremes. Versus left and right. Extremes is unfair. I'm sorry. And then you could also make the argument that you see Jerry Brown and Antonio Yergosa and Arnold make, is that they're sort of the realists, the hard-headed realists, versus the fantasy folks who don't really have an alternative. I would submit there's a bit of truth in that argument. But those divides are really clear. And I think the other solution that you're leaving out, a really important one, and when you said partition, a little bit of New America and toot Mark's horn, that's close. Look, we really need to reform how the legislature is constituted. I think how large it is, how it represents people. And Mark has a plan with another person in New America that talks about a more regional legislature with regional representation, and where we would elect people by regions. It's actually worth looking at that. Once we get through this crisis, we need that kind of bigger reform.
I would say, in terms of what's your alternative, again, I think the lottery, people can decide whether they want to plug a $5 billion number, maybe a much bigger number, into the budget solution and how real you think it is. Prop 1D and Prop 1A, billion-dollar hole. We are going to wake up, if the legislative analyst is right, and all of these measures pass with an $8 billion hole in the budget on May 20th. Nobody. Have you heard the governor offer a solution? Have you heard the Democratic leaders in the legislature offer a solution for what they're going to do on May 20th? No. My concern, this goes back to the trust question, is that voters are going to be told, this is going to solve your problem. They're going to wake up on May 28th, I believe, is now the scheduled date for the release of the governor's May revision. And they're going to see headlines in newspapers saying, $8 billion best case shortfall in the budget. That, to me, is what undermines trust. When on May 1st, you get something in your mailbox saying, this is going to solve all of our problems, on June 1st, you open your newspaper, and we're awash in red ink. That, I think, is the problem. You're not hearing any of the proponents of the package tell you what their plan is for that $8 billion hole in the budget. I honestly don't know. I think we are, and I think we are in a world of pain. I think my solutions, unfortunately, I think I agree with Mark going back to his opening comments, that we need to look at the history, everything in our Constitution that limits and constrains what we can do, because that does tell you that we're in a pretty small box when we wake up after the election. I think it's incredibly tough. An $8 billion hole, let me just give you an idea. We spend about $12 billion on state prisons, so we could let out 2/3 of the people in the prison system. We could close down, we spend about the same $12 billion on UC and CSU. We could close down 2/3 of the colleges and universities in this state. That is the kind of hole that we're talking about. We spend about $2 billion on welfare programs. So you could get rid of, if that's your perspective, maybe that's John's idea, that doesn't even begin to get you where you need to go.
We're out of time.
Can
We're
I
gonna
just
let
make
Mark have the last.
one little response?
Yeah.
You know, one of the great things about working in New America is there's no orthodoxy. So I just, in response to what Joe said about this strange coalition, it's actually not so strange, because we had exactly the same one in 2004 when the voters, you remember Arnold Schwarzenegger came and said, we're going to tear up the credit card, we're going to borrow once, and then never borrow again, and we're going to require a balanced budget. The exact same coalition supported that. I'm going to let you judge how well that took. Go ahead.
Well,